So let's talk about layers. Here I have two layers. We can take layers and we can group them together into a layer set. We can also nest layers by dragging one into another. These are similar but different. I'll talk about layer groups first. So layer groups have a frame. It looks like this. It looks like a bounding box, but it is not a bounding box. Notice that if I scale it or squeeze it around, the contents don't change because this is separate from the contents inside. The bounding box is important, or the frame is important, because we can use it to mask layers that are contained within. This is how we'll set up scrolling. Okay, I'll talk about that later. The important thing to notice here, though, is that scaling the frame doesn't affect the contents. However, rotating does. The interesting thing about the frame is that it's not just for layer sets. Every layer has a frame. So this bounding box right here isn't just the bounding box of a rectangle, and it's not just a vector rectangle. The layer has a background color, and we see the background colors through the frame. Now if I do this with something with an image content, the scaling or the frame resizing doesn't quite do the same thing. It's not ad hoc. It sticks to the size of, or the aspect ratio of the image inside. So they look like they're kind of shapes or maybe something, pieces in Illustrator, but it's not quite the same. So check this out. Here's a layer. It has a frame. It's also displaying an image, but it can have a background fill. So this frame detail is kind of important if we were to nest the things together. So I'm going to take this layer and I'll put it inside this gray box layer. Notice that the frame is only this big. It doesn't really fit the contents here. So with principal layers, how do I say this? With principal layers, the frame by default will allow other contents to show, but we can turn that off just like we did before by clipping the sublayers. So now it's hidden. But if I drag this frame over, notice that it becomes revealed. So in this way, the nested layers work kind of like a layer group. The catch is that this layer, that's kind of the parent, its content is still displayed, although it's displayed behind any of its children. So if I create another rectangle, maybe I make it red like that, and I'll put it inside this layer too. There it is. So you can think of the frame as kind of a window through which we see whatever the background contents is. And the background contents can be a fill color and or an image. Now we also have the stroke here, and I think that the combination of this word fill and this word stroke together makes it seem like that this is some kind of like vector shape. But there's no points in here. The frame rectangle is a mathematical construct through which we see some kind of image data. The interesting thing is that we can put a stroke on this rectangle. And if we do, it goes on top of everything. I guess with the, yeah, so let's talk about layer groups somewhere. So with a layer group, we can move this around and we can rotate it like you would expect. And then we can change the frame to hide and expose contents. Now, I mentioned that cropping the contents is important because it allows us to scroll the contents. Over here on the left, if I set this to scroll, oh, wrong axis. I can scroll the contents within that frame. One important thing to know about layer sets is that they can be, or layer groups, whatever you want to call it, these little folder guys, we can animate them just like we would any other layer. A layer group is effectively just a layer. An interesting thing about animating layer sets, or really any kind of layer, is that we can animate the frame. So this might look like this, and on this thing I can take the frame and squeeze it down to 0. Maybe turn on the clipping. And there we go. I have an animated hide. Now, if you look carefully, you'll notice a little popping here on the bottom. The problem is, and that you saw this in actually 2 places, this property, although it can change from artboard to artboard, cannot change gradually. So by default, if this is, not by default, but when we begin that animation, the layer set over here is set to clip sublayers, that change will happen immediately. So it kind of behooves me to make sure that that's consistent from one place to another. There we go, now I can prevent that clipping. That looks a bit better. Now, layer sets are animated just like any other layer. They're animated by their name. So if the name changes, we're not going to get what we want. No transition. It's not that it's not animating from here to here, from this size to that size, is that the transition doesn't even know what layers go together to animate in the first place. So the takeaway from this is, as you're building your composition and you're nesting your layers together in different ways, make sure that you name your layer sets similarly. So I might have a layer set here, I can copy and then I can paste it to make sure that the name is preserved, and then I can animate it in some way.